The body is rarely the first thing to quit. It feels like it is. The burning in your muscles, the weight in your chest, the exhaustion building with every step. It feels physical. It feels real. It feels final. But most of the time, the body is still capable. What actually quits first is the mind. The mind sends signals. Stop. Slow down. This is enough. And those signals feel convincing because they are designed to protect you, to conserve energy, to avoid discomfort. But protection is not the same as limitation. The mind does not measure your true capacity. It estimates. It predicts. It guesses how much you can handle. And it almost always underestimates because it is biased towards safety, toward conserving effort, toward avoiding strain. This is why you feel like stopping long before you are actually finished. You feel tired, but you can take another step. You feel pressure, but you can continue the work. You feel resistance, but you can still act. That gap between what you feel and what you are capable of is where most people stop. Not because they reached their limit, because they believed the signal. They interpreted discomfort as the end. They treated resistance as failure. They assumed the feeling meant they were done. But discomfort is not the signal to stop. It is the signal that effort has begun. The moment it becomes difficult, the moment it becomes uncomfortable, the moment the mind begins to resist, that is where growth starts. The problem is not the discomfort itself. The problem is how quickly people respond to it, how quickly they step back, how quickly they disengage. Because the mind is persuasive. It does not shout. It suggests. It negotiates. Just stop here. You've done enough. You can continue tomorrow. And most people listen, not because they are weak, because they are untrained. Untrained to recognize the difference between real limits and perceived limits. Real limits are physical. They stop you. They force you to rest. Perceived limits are mental. They suggest stopping, but they can be ignored. This distinction changes everything, because once you see it, you stop trusting the first signal. You begin to question it, and that is where control begins. Not when the body feels strong, but when the mind tells you to stop, and you continue anyway. The mind does not tell you to stop all at once. It begins quietly, subtly, almost reasonably. It does not say, "You cannot continue." It says, "Maybe you should stop." That suggestion feels harmless, even logical, even responsible. You've done enough. You can rest now. You can continue later. The mind presents these thoughts as protection, as if stopping is the correct decision, as if continuing would be unnecessary risk. And most people accept it, not because they are incapable, but because the argument sounds reasonable. This is how the mind limits you, not through force, through suggestion, through negotiation, through small permissions to stop. One pause becomes a habit. One delay becomes a pattern. One moment of stopping becomes the standard. And over time, that standard becomes your limit. You begin to associate discomfort with stopping, resistance with quitting, effort with avoidance. Until the moment things become difficult, you automatically disengage. This pattern does not only exist in physical effort, It appears in work, in focus, in discipline. You start a task. You feel resistance. The mind suggests a break. You stop. You return later. The same resistance appears again. The same suggestion returns. And the cycle repeats. This is how progress slows. Not because effort is impossible, but because the mind keeps interrupting it. The interruption feels small, almost insignificant, but repeated often enough, it becomes the dominant pattern. And that pattern shapes your results. Because consistency is broken, momentum is lost. Progress becomes unstable. Meanwhile, the person who continues builds a different pattern. They feel the same resistance. They hear the same suggestions. They experience the same discomfort. But they respond differently. They continue, even if it is slower, even if it is uncomfortable. That small decision creates separation. Not immediately, but over time. One person stops when the mind suggests it. The other continues past that suggestion. That difference compounds, quietly, relentlessly, until one person develops endurance and the other develops a habit of stopping. Because the mind always speaks first, but it does not always tell the truth. And learning to ignore it is where discipline begins. If you're serious about building this mindset, follow and subscribe. Everything here is about discipline, focus, and real progress. There is a point most people never reach. Not because they cannot reach it, but because they stop just before it. It comes after the initial resistance, after the first wave of discomfort, after the moment the mind tells you to stop. Most people obey that signal. They step back. They pause the effort. They disengage. But if you continue, something different begins to happen. The discomfort does not disappear immediately, but it begins to change. It becomes more predictable, more manageable. Your breathing stabilizes. Your focus sharpens. Your movement becomes more controlled. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel structured, less chaotic, less urgent. This is the point where most people would have already stopped. They never experience this shift because they interpret the first signal as the limit instead of the beginning. The first wave of resistance is not the end. It is the entry point. Beyond that point, the mind begins to lose control. Its signals become less convincing, less urgent, because you did not obey it. You continued. That continuation teaches the mind something new, that discomfort is survivable, that resistance is temporary, that effort can extend further than expected. This lesson is powerful because it changes how the mind responds next time. The signal to stop still appears, but it carries less authority, less urgency, less control, because you have already gone beyond it. This is how endurance is built, not through one moment of intensity, but through repeated exposure to resistance. Each time you continue, you expand your threshold. You extend your capacity. You redefine your limits. Not dramatically, not instantly, but gradually. One step further, one repetition longer, one moment past the urge to stop. Over time, these small extensions compound. What once felt impossible becomes manageable. What once felt overwhelming becomes routine. This is where real separation begins, between those who stop at discomfort and those who move through it. Because one group never experiences the shift. They remain limited by the first signal. The other group moves beyond it and discovers a different level of capability, a level that was always there but rarely reached. Because the mind quit first, and they did not follow it. They stayed long enough to see what was actually possible. At a certain point, the process begins to reverse. The mind still speaks. It still sends signals. It still suggests stopping. But the response changes. You no longer react immediately. You no longer treat the signal as a command. You recognize it for what it is, a suggestion, not a limit. This recognition is where control begins to stabilize, because the mind loses its authority. It still speaks, but it no longer decides. You begin to separate sensation from action. Discomfort is present, but it no longer determines your behavior. Fatigue exists. Resistance appears. The urge to stop returns. But you continue anyway. This repetition builds something deeper than motivation. It builds control. It builds stability. It builds discipline that does not depend on how you feel. At this stage, effort becomes different. Not easier, but more structured, more predictable. The mind still resists, but the resistance no longer disrupts the process. It becomes part of it. Something expected, something normal. This is where most people misunderstand discipline. They believe disciplined people feel less resistance. They believe effort becomes easy. It does not. The difference is not the absence of resistance. It is the response to it. The disciplined person feels the same signals, the same discomfort, the same urge to stop, but they no longer obey it. That shift creates consistency. Consistency creates momentum. Momentum creates results. And those results begin to reinforce the behavior. They confirm that continuing was correct. They strengthen the pattern. The mind adapts again, but this time it adapts to discipline. It learns that stopping is not automatic. It learns that discomfort does not end the process. Over time, the signals weaken, not because they disappear, but because they lose influence. You begin to operate independently of them. The action continues regardless of how you feel. This is the point where discipline becomes reliable, not dependent on motivation, not dependent on energy, not dependent on mood, only dependent on repetition. And that repetition changes everything, because once the mind loses control, the body is no longer held back, and what once felt like a limit becomes just another step forward. In the end, the difference is not physical. Most people have more capacity than they ever use, more strength, more endurance, more ability than they allow themselves to reach. But that capacity is rarely accessed, not because it does not exist, because the mind interrupts it. The signal appears, stop, slow down, this is enough. And most people follow it, automatically, without questioning it. That is why their limits stay where they are, unchanged, unchallenged. Because limits are not only physical, they are reinforced by behavior, by repeated responses to discomfort. Every time you stop at the first signal, you confirm the limit. You strengthen it. You make it real. Every time you continue, even slightly, you extend it. That extension may feel small, almost insignificant. One more step, one more repetition, one more moment of effort. But those small extensions compound. They reshape your capacity. They redefine your limits. Over time, the difference becomes clear. One person stayed within the signal, the other moved beyond it. Years pass. The gap widens, not dramatically, but steadily. One life remains controlled by discomfort. The other becomes independent from it. That independence is discipline. Not the absence of resistance, but the ability to continue despite it. Because resistance never disappears. The signal never stops. The mind never becomes silent. But your response changes. And that changes everything. You stop obeying the first signal. You stop treating discomfort as the end. You stop accepting the first limit. And once that happens, your capacity expands. Your endurance grows. Your discipline stabilizes. Because the mind may quit first, but you no longer follow it. If this message resonated with you, like the video and subscribe. The next limit is already in front of you.